Hello, and thank you for joining us this evening for our wastewater rate informational webinar. You may be familiar with Zoom meetings, but this is a Zoom webinar which works a little differently from a Zoom meeting, and that you'll only see and hear the speakers today. Everyone else will be muted without camera access. You can ask your question at any time by entering it into the Q&A panel in Zoom. We'll be presenting for about 45 minutes and we'll answer any questions at the end of the presentation. The recording will be published to the website next week, and it will also be translated into Spanish as well. And now I would like to introduce Amanda Flessy, our wastewater system manager.
Thank you, Madeline. Next slide, please. As Madeline said, my name is Amanda Flessy. I'm the wastewater manager, and I just want to do a quick introduction of our wastewater rates and why we continue to need our wastewater rates for the next 3 years. We continue to make an investment in our wastewater system, which is essential in ensuring the public health and safety and environmental protection. We've done a series of studies for capital improvement projects, which kind of support the rates. We are trying to be proactive in our repairs and our upgrades to help avoid really cost and very expensive repairs that are emergency repairs. Just like the rest of the nation, we are impacted by inflation cost and our operation cost. For instance, our chemicals that we use on a day-to-day basis to treat our wastewaters in this year alone have gone up 60%, as well as our hauling has gone up probably 40%. And a lot of our materials that we need for our capital projects and our construction costs also continue to go up over 30%. So these investments that we're making in today with our wastewater rates today, we can continue to make those investments, and we must ensure that the rates that we kind of implement today will help with our critical infrastructure and operations needs as we move forward into the future. Now I'd like to introduce Ms. Dana Hoffman. She will go over today's agenda and our rates.
Good evening. My name is Dana Hoffman. I'm a water resources analyst, and I'm going to be talking to you today about our rates and the rate study. So first of all, tonight's agenda, we're going to do a little bit of timeline, look into financial planning, then get into rate study considerations and objectives. Then we'll talk about the rate study recommendations and outcomes. And at the end, we'll have time for a Q&A. Next slide, please. Looking at the timeline, this is a public process. So all throughout this process, we've had public meetings. We've had 3 visits to the Water Commission where we've discussed the rate model and the outcomes of the rate model and have received policy input. We went to the Finance Committee at the end of March, and then we will be going to City Council June 14th for a public hearing on the utility rates. Next slide, please. All right, so let's jump into some financial planning considerations. Next. All right, so let's take a look at the wastewater system assets. This photo here is an aerial image of the Elliston Water Resource Center. So we have a pretty robust wastewater system. We have 256 miles of sewer mains, 2 miles of force mains, 7 lift stations, multiple creek crossings, and over 7,000 structures for manholes and clean access. So we have a great, robust system that does a lot for our public health and safety and the environment, and we do need to make sure that we invest in it to make sure it operates 24/7, 365. Next slide, please. So how do we fund the system? 99% of the revenues to operate the system comes from wastewater rates. That means what you pay on your wastewater utility bill. So that means that the wastewater fund, the wastewater utility, does not receive any revenues from taxes. So we don't receive revenues from sales taxes, property taxes, anything like that. We also do not receive Measure C funding, which you may know funds some streets operations and things around town. So we are really entirely dependent on what we collect through our wastewater rates to make sure that the system operates correctly. Next slide, please. So what does your wastewater bill actually pay for? As you can see, we do a lot in the wastewater utility. We physically collect your wastewater through sewer laterals and sewer mains. Those bring the wastewater to the wastewater treatment to get treated at the Elistero Water Treatment Center. Of course, there's general administrative costs. There's debt service costs. So these are the costs that we use to repay loans that we use to fund our capital investments. And then, of course, there's the capital investment portion as well. And just as a note, salaries and benefits are included within all of these sections. They account for about 30% of total expenses. So that is quite low than what you would expect from most governmental departments, which tend to be more administratively heavy and see a lot higher percentages, but salary and benefits for the wastewater utility is only lying around 30%. Next slide, please. All right, so let's look more at the wastewater system costs. So revenues need to be sufficient to cover the operating and capital costs of the utility, to meet state and federal regulations, and pay debt obligations and maintain reserves. So we have two main costs. We have our operating costs, so that's the ongoing day-to-day maintenance operations of the utility, and then we have a capital cost. So for example, we're doing a large electrical upgrade at the Elistero Water Resource Center, that's pictured here, and that's something that that would count as a capital cost. Next slide, please. All right, so what are some cost trends that the utility is seeing? Our recent inflationary increases, as everyone knows, have been very high. The city is not immune to that. So just as everything, the cost of most things are inflating, the city has to bear that burden as well. For example, as Ms. Flessy mentioned earlier, our chemical costs have gone up a lot. We've seen very high increases in chemical costs. We've also seen very high increases in our hauling, for example. Those costs have doubled. So again, these are some things we have to consider when we're looking at changes to our utility rates. Going forward into the future, we didn't want to assume that this runaway inflation would keep happening. That would really heavily impact our customers. So we were more conservative in that approach, and we assumed that inflation would back down back to 3.5%. And so we just need to make sure we have adequate revenues to make our investments in our utility, such as Elistero improvements, collection system improvements, and the sewer lateral program. Next slide, please. All right, so let's take a look at more capital investments. This slide, we're going to focus on the treatment aspect, so what's happening at the Elistero Water Resource Center. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be looking at a large electrical renewal project at the plant. This is going to help with consistency in treatment of the wastewater, and it's also going to increase our ability to produce renewable energy at the plant. Right now, the plant does produce 40% of its own energy, so this project will help with that renewable energy production. We also have a chlorine contact chamber renewal project going on that's going to provide additional redundancy to help things operate more smoothly and effectively, and it's going to increase the quality of discharged wastewater from the plant into the environment. Next slide, please. All right, so let's take a look at capital investment on the collection side. So in this picture, you'll see the pumps that are at the Braemar lift station. The Braemar lift station is the largest pump station in town. It handles the most wastewater of all of our lift stations. And so lift stations move the wastewater around the system and get the wastewater to where it needs to go. And so these pumps are getting old, they need to be replaced. So that's one project that we're working on. We're also working on the Via Lucero Force Main project. This is going to provide more redundancy in the system to ensure the system can still operate if there is a failure in another part of the system. And of course, the big thing we're looking at is sea level rise adaptation. Some key assets of the wastewater system are at low lying points around the city. And so we are engaging in a study to determine how to mitigate impacts from sea level rise, either by moving or shoring up assets. And this is for both the collection system and the treatment plant. So this is a really critical project as we're facing climate change and sea level rise. Next slide, please. All right, so another big program we have going on is the pipeline replacement and rehabilitation program. You can see on this slide, there is a map that shows pipelines we've already replaced, pipelines that are under construction, and pipelines that are slated for rehab or rehabilitation in the next 3 years. Our goal is to replace or rehab approximately 1% of the system. That's over 2.5 miles annually. And this is going to help us maintain our overflow compliance. If we don't maintain our pipes, that can cause sewer overflows, sewer spills, which is definitely not good. And so we want to stay on top of that as much as we can. And so that's what this program allows us to do. We're also looking at general capacity improvements, seeing what areas of the system we need to make larger to accommodate development and more capacity. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's take a look at some of our customer programs. So some of you may be familiar with the SLIP program, the Sewer Lateral Inspection Program. It is meant to reduce sewer spills both from the city's pipes and from private customer pipes. So this is critical for protecting public health and safety as well as environmental health. Again, we don't want sewer spills happening in the community. The Video Assistance Program is part of the SLIP program, and it offers financial assistance to help customers through the SLIP program by using the city's contracted CCTV inspector to assess repair needs. And we do have various repair options for our customers. We offer multiple tailored options that a customer can choose from that works best for them. You can either work more with your own plumber, if that's what you're more comfortable with, or alternatively, you can elect to have more full service from the city directly. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's get into some rate setting considerations and objectives. So let's take a look at where we've been previously. We did a rate study back in 2019, and we adopted, again, a 3-year rate plan, and that's what we're doing again now. So we're continuing the pattern of reevaluating our needs and our revenues every 3 years. So this is just a continuation of our past policy. So we're going to be looking at what our rates are going to be for the next 3 years. Next slide, please. So what composes a wastewater bill? We have fixed charges and we have variable charges. So looking at a residential bill, you're going to get a fixed charge every month. That's based on how many dwelling units the account is serving. And then there's going to be variable charges that are based on how much water you use, because that's a good proxy for how much water you're discharging into the wastewater system. For our single-family residential customers, there is a cap on volumetric charges because it's assumed that after a certain point of water usage, that water is probably being applied to landscaping. For our commercial customers, there is a fixed minimum bill, and then there's a variable charge per unit of water used. So you're charged per unit of water usage, but if you don't hit that minimum bill, then you just get that minimum bill. So because there's a variable component to our bills, it does allow customers to have some kind of control over what they're seeing in their wastewater bill. Next slide, please. So minimizing rate impacts, so as much as we can, is very important to us as the utility. We do that through some major different points. One of the major points is planning. We look at financial planning, operations and maintenance planning, capital planning. We look at what projects are coming up, what needs replacing, and we slate those projects strategically when we think we can get financing. So again, we do this to make sure that we can replace things when they need to replace before they break. Because if something breaks and we have to do an emergency repair, that gets very expensive very quickly. So we're always trying to look forward and plan ahead so that we can mitigate any kind of emergency costly repairs. Grants and financing. We have a pretty comprehensive grant pursuit strategy so that we can mitigate those costs that are going to our customers as much as possible. When we can't get grants, we try and get very low interest rate loans, and these are usually from the state. What this allows us to do is finance really large, expensive projects, but spread the costs over time. So we don't get huge hits to our customers that cause really high rate increases. And those loans are really low interest rates, which is great. We do have some customer assistance programs. We offer free water checkups with our water conservation specialists that can help our customers identify if they might have leaks or inefficiencies on their property. We do have a leak relief program in case people experience a catastrophic leak or break on their property. We do have some relief programs there for that. A UUT waiver, so utility users tax. Certain folks may qualify to have that tax waived for them. And as I mentioned earlier, we do have the SLIP program. We do have some assistance built into the split program for customers that need some assistance getting through that program. Next slide, please. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to our expert rate consultant, Mr. Sean Korn, who helped us put together this rate study, and he's with HDR Engineering.
Thank you, Dana. Good evening, everybody. I look forward to talking through this rate study with you all. This evening, I'm going to talk briefly about the rate setting objectives, the process and approach we use to establish the proposed rates, some of the rate structure adjustments and changes that are being recommended, and then a summary of the overall rate study and overall adjustments to rates. On the next slide, we talk a bit about our rate setting objectives. And as we kick off a rate study, we want to identify those goals and objectives to help guide us through this process. There's several generally accepted rate setting objectives. Some of them are on the screen here. As we talk through the revenue sufficiency and stability component, really what we're focusing on is sufficient revenue over time to support those operating and capital needs that Ms. Hoffenberger was talking about. The stability is maintaining stable rates over time. That means that we're not seeing those large increases at different periodic times throughout the course of 5 or 10 years, but steady increases to reflect those increases from inflation and those capital funding needs. As we go through this, we also want to address affordability impacts to the customers. And one of the ways we do that is what Ms. Hoffenberger just talked about in the overall UUT exemption, some of those water conservation evaluations to reduce the amount of water use that is billed under the cap for the residential customers. A key element of this study, and really the requirement for the city to do this study, is to maintain proportional rates for the different customer classes of service. Those customer classes of service are single family, multifamily, and commercial primarily. And so we think about how each of those customer groups as a whole need to support the costs based on the benefits they receive from the city providing them wastewater services. That meets the legal requirement, which is based on Proposition 218, which lays out the approach, and that's codified in the California Constitution. We also think about how those rates are charged to customers. We want to make sure that they're easy to understand so that a customer understands why their bill is the amount it is, as well as for the city to administer that and explain that to customers. So starting out with this process, we looked at these different goals and objectives. Our focus was on the revenue sufficiency and stability and meeting the requirements of Proposition 218, and then also taking into consideration the affordability and ability to understand and administer those rates. On the next slide, I'll talk a bit more in detail about how we develop the overall rate study process. And it's really a 3-step process, and it includes a revenue requirement, a cost of service, and a rate design. The revenue requirement, as the name implies, determines what level of rate revenue is necessary to support the operating and capital needs of the wastewater utility. So as was shown earlier in that pie-looking chart, the vast majority of the revenues for the wastewater utility come through rates from customers. So as we evaluate the funding needs, we look at the annual operation and maintenance expenses. Those are projected out over a multi-year period. And then we look at, within that analysis, how the city will be funding the necessary wastewater capital improvements. Are those going to be funded on an annual basis through rates, through grants or loan programs? And what impact does that have on the total revenue requirement as we develop those projections over a multi-year period? We actually developed the model for a 10-year period with a focus on the next 3 years for the rate setting process. So that revenue requirement I can think about as the size of the pie. So it tells us how much revenue we need in each year. The cost of service analysis then takes that pie and splits it up between the different customer classes based on how they use the service. So each customer class gets a piece of the pie based on their characteristics. When we develop this cost of service, it's there to meet the requirements of Proposition 218 so that each class receives their proportional distribution of costs based on how they use the system. So when we think of a wastewater system, there's several key drivers. One is the total volume or wastewater flow that goes through the city's sewer collection system and ultimately to the El Estero treatment plant. Within that flow, we think about the strength of that flow. The higher the strength of the flow, the more time it takes and the more costly it is to treat that wastewater to a level that can ultimately then be discharged. So the cost of service looks at each of the customer classes of service, single family, multifamily, and our commercial classes, as well as a high strength customer class, and determines each class's proportional share of the cost. So if a customer class has a higher strength component, they receive a higher proportional share of those strength costs, which goes into developing their ultimate proposed rates. So once we know the revenue requirement, the amount of revenue that's needed, and the cost of service, and how much we need to collect from each class, then we can design rates based on those two. And ultimately, those rates are the result of that cost of service and the unit costs or cost-based rates that are developed. So that rate design looks at how are we designing that rate and what you as a customer see on your bill. So for each class of service, based on the cost of service, we develop the overall proposed rates to meet the overall funding needs and proportionality requirements of Proposition 218. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about the rate design. That revenue requirement analysis and that cost of service analysis are very detailed, and the report that supports the study outlines all of those key assumptions. But as we go through the rate structure discussion, we looked at a couple different changes that we're recommending as part of the proposed rates. As was mentioned earlier, the single family customers are billed based on their water use up to 10 HCF per month. Now an HCF is 100 cubic feet, and each 100 cubic feet is 748 gallons. So that 10 HCF cap was based on historical single-family consumption data and what that average use was going to be for the system. So anything above that is presumed to be used outside the home or not coming back through the wastewater system. Looking at the more recent history and single-family consumption patterns, what we noticed over the last several years is that usage pattern has reduced as conservation principles have come online and more frequently discussed. Customers have reduced their overall water consumption. So as we looked at the wastewater rate structure, given the reduction in water use, we're recommending reducing the cap from 10 HCF to 8 HCF over a 2-year period. So the first year, the study would reduce the cap to 9 HCF, and the second year would be reducing it to the 8 HCF, what would remain for the third year of the proposed rates. In this way, customers' usage more accurately reflects what wastewater volumes are being sent through the wastewater system. For multifamily customers, there are 2 customer classes. There's a 2 to 4 units, and there's a 5 and greater unit category. For the multifamily 2 to 4 units, the billing units are based on the water usage up to 10 HCF per month. So very similar approach to what a single family billing is today. However, when we looked at the data and information for the multifamily 2 to 4 unit accounts, those accounts very rarely went above that 10 HCF per month. Given that, we're recommending the elimination of the cap based on the lack of variability between winter and summer water usage. So When we see that greater than 10 or 8, in this case, recommended HCF for single family, that's generally in those summer periods when we're watering lawns and doing other outdoor activities. For the multifamily 2 to 4 units, there wasn't that variability. It was a very constant amount of water use over the course of a year. For multifamily 5+ units, for those rates, it is based on water use with no cap. So for multifamily 2 to 4 and multifamily 5+, the recommendation is to have the same rate structure with no cap on their usage. Non-residential customers, so all the commercial entities, and there's 2 classes of that as well, based on lower strength and higher strength, then they're based on all their water use with no cap. So that there's no recommended change to that. That will remain in place going forward. The only change to the non-residential rate structure is a recommended recalibration to the minimum bill calculation. So as was mentioned earlier, the non-residential customers are billed a minimum charge, the lesser of the minimum charge or the volumetric charge times their water usage. So in this case, that minimum bill calculation needed to be updated to reflect more recent consumption patterns for the non-residential customers as well. So to summarize on the next slide, our overall revenue requirement gave us a recommendation to increase rates over the next 3 years to adequately fund the operating and capital needs of the utility. The projected rate revenue increase is 7%, approximately 7% over the next 3 years. And that's based on the overall need to fund that annual inflationary increases in O&M expenses that the city is experiencing, as well as to adequately fund those necessary capital improvements to continue to provide the level of service to the city's customers. And those were previously outlined with the El Estero improvements, the collection system improvements, and so on. So the study's taken into account the overall revenue needs based on the operating and capital costs. Those costs have then been allocated and proportionally distributed to each of the different customer classes based on their overall benefit of the system, based on annual water wastewater volumes and strength of those wastewater volumes. And the proposed rates then reflect this overall 3-step process to meet the requirements of Proposition 218. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ms. Hoffenberg to discuss some of the bill impacts to the different customers.
Thank you, Mr. Corn. All right, so let's talk about what this will actually do to utility bills. Next slide, please. So here's a comparison between the city's wastewater charges and some of our neighboring agencies. So a couple things to note. This is a bill for a low water using customer. And this is compared to Goleta Sanitary District, Montecito Sanitary District, and Carpinteria Sanitary District. So this is our proposed rates that are going to become effective in July, but it is compared to the existing rates for those neighboring agencies. They didn't have data quite yet on their proposed rates, so we are just comparing their existing rates, so it's very possible those rates will change. Next. All right, so this is comparing the city's wastewater bill for a more typical single-family residential customer. So they have more typical usage of 9 HCF. So this is a very average customer. So you might notice that our neighboring agencies' bills did not change. And that's because our neighboring agencies, they charge a flat annual rate on the tax roll. So customers don't have an ability to adjust their bills based on their water consumption. And so that is something that the city is able to do because we have a volumetric component to our rates. So you can see for the low water users, we are one of the lowest bills among our neighboring agencies. And then for the average customer, we're right in the pack, right in the middle. Next slide, please. All right, so let's take a look at what this will mean for your full city utility bill. So something to keep in mind is that a utility bill from the city actually has multiple services on it. It has water service, wastewater service, and trash and recycling and greenway service. So altogether, the total proposed changes to all of the different utilities, and this is for a very average typical single family residential customer with average usage and average level of service for trash and recycling, they're looking at less than a 5% increase to the total utility bill for all three services. Slide, please. Next steps, we will be going to City Council to hold a public hearing on the utility rates. It will be for wastewater rates and trash and recycling rates. If you do have more questions specifically on recycling, trash and recycling rates, you can visit their website that's listed here. And we will also be posting this presentation and translating it into Spanish and online. That'll be viewable after this webinar has concluded. Slide. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Madeline for our Q&A.
Great, thank you, Ms. Hoffenberg. So we'd like to open it up for any Q&A. You can go ahead and type it into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we can see those rolling in. Let's see, so we've got a question that came in. Why raise rates now? You know, we've been talking about inflation. So why raise rates now? Why not wait for later when inflation has stabilized?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. So I've mentioned earlier, so we have carefully created operations and maintenance plans, capital plans. We do a lot of planning. And so these plans look into the future and identify key projects that are needed to keep the system operating safely. So delaying these rate increases means we won't have the money to complete this work, essentially. And those delays in operations and maintenance and capital improvements could create the need for very expensive emergency repairs. You know, if we're not doing the upkeep on the system, things might break and we will need to respond in an emergency fashion. And then if we don't do these increases now, you know, things just get more expensive, construction costs increase. So just delaying this will just cause a bigger cost increase down the line. And again, emergency repairs will be even more expensive because inflation will have gone up. And then another aspect of that is, you know, as I mentioned earlier, one of the strategies we use to keep costs down is to secure low interest rate loans. In order to get those loans, we need to show that we have adequate debt service coverage ratios so that we're in a good position essentially to pay back those loans. Without this rate increase, we won't be able to show that we can do that. And without these low interest rate loans, we have to delay improvements. And again, this could compromise our ability to provide safe and reliable service and would result in costs just even increasing and even more.
Great, thank you. Another question, what is the UUT exemption and how would someone qualify for that?
Sure, so UUT is utility users tax. It's a 6% tax on several utility services in town, including water and trash and recycling. So wastewater actually doesn't receive the utility tax. Certain folks may qualify for the waiver based on your adjusted gross income. Your income has to be below a certain level. I believe it's around $19,000 or $20,000 for a single person. So applications are accepted year round. You can contact utility billing to apply. And so you can either email them or you can call them. Their phone number is 805-564-5343. And their email is utilitybilling@santabarbaraca.gov.
Great, thank you. Those are all the questions that we have this evening. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we will be posting the recording next week. Thank you everyone, bye-bye.